of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Breaking news tonight from Davos. President Trump says he will no longer impose Greenland-related tariffs against Europe on allies February 1st, citing a framework deal between Trump and the NATO chief. But what are the details, and is the rest of Europe on board? Also, markets surging on the news just a day after fears of a global trade war were setting in. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick standing by with more on the Wall Street response. Also, power check at the Supreme Court. The High Court today hearing arguments pitting presidential powers against the Fed's independence. Can President Trump fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook? We'll have a full report this hour. But we begin with the major reversal from President Trump and his pursuit of Greenland, taking to social media earlier today to announce the beginnings of a deal. Posting, quote, based upon a very productive meeting that I have had with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland. And he writes, in fact, the entire Arctic region. This solution, if consummated, will be a great one for the United States of America and all NATO nations. Based upon this understanding, he says, I will not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect February 1st. Additional discussions are being held concerning the Golden Dome as it pertains to Greenland. That's the Post. Now, for a look at how the markets reacted to this news, which came out just a couple of hours ago, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, the taco trade is still alive?
Yeah, I always hated that phrase, but I don't think you can call this anything other than that, Joe. Remember, the markets really came into today really on edge, coming off that big sell-off yesterday, and of course, coming into what was anticipated to be that big speech at Davos by President Trump at 8:30 a.m. Now, you have a Bloomberg terminal. I'm pretty sure you do, Joe. And you could play an interesting parlor game here. You could pull up one screen with a sort of an intraday moves on the S&P 500 and pull up another screen with all of the headlines on Trump and the things that he said over the course of the day. And there is a direct correlation to the ups and downs that we saw in this market. A bit of a rally to start the day, up about 1%. By about 1 p.m. here, about 12 p.m. Eastern time, we actually saw stocks almost erase almost all of those gains because of concerns here that we were headed for a bit more of a showdown. And then, of course, we started to get those redheads. The news that President Trump had apparently agreed to some sort of a framework of a deal with NATO, and more importantly, that he would hold off on imposing those tariffs on February 1st against those countries that didn't go along with his Greenland plan. And well, stocks, they took off, having their best days since November. And in fact, this was actually the broadest trading range for the S&P 500 that we've seen going back to late November. And it really sort of solidified this idea, Joe, that sometimes when you get the chaos and you get the confusion coming out of Washington, that if you're a trader and you see that chaos and confusion, instead of running from it, some folks, they lean into it. JP Morgan put out some great data showing just how many retail investors bought into that dip yesterday. And today, based on the green on the screen, Joe, it paid off handsomely for quite a few folks.
Isn't that true? I'm just looking around the different sectors and indexes here, Romaine. The RSP, right back to its all-time high. Is this rotation real?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about this embrace of small caps, of mid caps, those so-called cyclical stocks, this is all sort of rooted in the idea, Joe, that economic conditions, not only here in the U.S., but globally, are going to be supportive of a lot of those names. And when you have these high-flying mega cap companies that are at these huge high valuations, people are looking for bargains and they want some modicum of safety, and they found it in a lot of those names. And I think that when you look at the idea not only of Trump backing off, but we've heard from a lot of folks today on the close, on my program earlier today, the idea that this is an election year, and there's going to be a lot of chatter behind the scenes in Trump's ear that not only does he have to address these affordability crisis here in the United States, but more importantly, not propose anything that would exacerbate it, or at least exacerbate it in the minds of voters. And there are a lot of people at least speculating that that might have had something to do with the, let's just say, a bit of a tamp down in the conquistador rhetoric that we've heard out of him as of late.
Well put. There was only one place to start tonight with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Romaine, thank you so much. This news caps a tense day in Davos when you consider the arc of the headlines that Romaine just mentioned, with President Trump beginning his day by pushing for immediate negotiations on Greenland, but also ruling out using military force.
What I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly located, that can play a vital role in world peace and world protection. It's a very small ask. compared to what we have given them for many, many decades.
We'll all see what happens. The military's not on the table. I don't think it'll be necessary. I really don't. Okay. I think people are going to use better judgment. They'll use their best judgment, and I don't think that will not be necessary.
Now, following the president's sit-down with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, a, quote, framework has been reached. And joining us now for more, Bloomberg's Laura Davison here in Washington. The semantics here, Laura, are important. We've heard about framework deals with our trade dealings with a number of different countries. In an interview on CNBC, the president actually called it the concept of a framework, presumably of a deal. Are we getting further away from an actual agreement?
A framework is a famous term in Washington, which means that maybe we've started to talk about a deal, but we don't actually know that we agree on the finer points of anything. We see this in Congress all the time. We've seen this with trade deals. We've seen this. Trump famously during one of the presidential debates said he has concepts of a plan on health care. I think we're still waiting to see what that looks like. So what we can anticipate here is that two sides are talking. They are at least making positive sounds at each other. But have they really spelled out what this looks like? Have the lawyers on both sides started looking at this? Absolutely not. They're still in that early stages. But this did give Trump enough space to back off from those tariffs, back off from kind of the use of military force. We've seen that positive market reaction from this, and this, is kind of how Trump likes to deal in this, of kind of being able to show that he gets something. And I think Mark Rutte at NATO has kind of figured out how to handle Trump in these situations.
Had a lot of compliments for him today. So it does seem that the news coming from Davos is more about what did not happen than what did happen. No tariffs will be implemented. There will be no military action. Those are the two real takeaways today, right?
Yes, I mean, and those are the things that that basically European leaders in the room were waiting on pins and needles to hear. Trump really came out swinging. He opened his speech, addressing all the leaders dignitaries and a few enemies in the room.
He sure did.
It was a really interesting speech, and you could kind of tell, he wanted to kind of needle folks, but he also acknowledged that things had maybe gotten a little bit out of hand and wanted to pull things back.
Interesting. We should note a curious development in the story. While some people were getting ready to go to sleep last night, the president's plane had to be turned around. Air Force One, packed with officials and reporters, was turned around on its way overseas because of what was described as an electrical problem. Do we have any more insights into that, or how rare an event that was?
We don't have any insights into what exactly that looks like, but this is exceptionally rare and is only going to feed Trump's animosity towards Air Force One and Boeing, who is the maker of Air Force One. He's really complained about this over several years, really going back to his first term, and that's where that plane he got from Qatar earlier this year that he wants to renovate and have all the security features to serve as Air Force One. So this is really only going to make Trump even more irate. He mentioned he didn't get a lot of sleep because of this airplane mishap.
Got to be true, Laura. Thank you so much. Bloomberg's Laura Davison on an important day here in politics. And joining us now with his insight on the geopolitical implications of President Trump's remarks, retired four-star U.S. Army General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, who knows a thing or two, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, about what we're talking about here, former Commander-in-Chief for U.S. Southcom. General, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Was this then a classic escalate only to de-escalate and take credit for it scenario here?
Well, it's a great way to work a deal in principle. I think the alliance is going to survive. I think there may be some hard feelings on some people's parts, but I think we've salvaged it, and so President Trump put the leverage on. The framework, we'll have to see what it is as well as the details. To me, it looks like it might be a trade-off between, let's say, sovereignty and authority. You might say Denmark retains full sovereignty. The U.S. has full authority on what can be done, what should be done, et cetera, in the Greenland. So maybe that's the basis for it. We don't know. It's only speculation at this point. But if you were in Denmark's position, sovereignty's what it's all about.
Well, few people on the planet know how NATO works as well as you do. The president is engaging the Secretary General of a military alliance on what to do with a sovereign territory. How does this hold? How does this stick without the Danes being involved?
Well, the Danes are involved, for sure. Yeah. I mean, Mark Rutte has certainly talked to Denmark. He knows exactly what they need, and he's the go-between. He's the buffer. He's had a good relationship with President Trump. He explains exactly what's needed. President Trump is looking for the right way to move forward on this, and so that's the framework. But then got to fill in the blanks.
Interesting. There's a New York Times report that we're talking about small pockets of land because it's been difficult for us to get our heads around what actually was accomplished. President says we'll be involved in rare earth minerals and small pockets of land. Are those military bases you suspect he's referring to? Well, there are also some pockets of land on the south and southwest and western coast where there are a lot of rare earth deposits. China's been very interested in those deposits. I'm sure President Trump would like to make sure China doesn't get its hands on any of those rare earth deposits. Some are radioactive, so this has been a complication, and there's been some restrictions on dealing with radioactive rare earths, and that's one of the things probably that the president would like to see lifted out there. And obviously, there are going to have to be numerous locations where Golden Dome is going to be, where some patrol boats can be, and probably put a few more U.S. service members up in the region. Okay. I want to get your take on the way the president has been framing NATO today. He showed up this morning. I realized he was probably sleep deprived after the plane had to be turned around last night. But pretty remarkable to hear the language and the rhetoric from the president of the United States with regard to this alliance. Here's a taste of what he said in Davos this morning.
NATO has treated the United States of America very unfairly. We never asked for anything. We never got anything. The problem with NATO is that we'll be there for them 100%. But I'm not sure that they'd be there for us. Other presidents have spent, whether foolishly or not, trillions and trillions of dollars on NATO and gotten absolutely nothing in return. We've never asked for anything. It's always a one-way street.
Of course, it was not a one-way street after 9/11, General, and I'm wondering your thoughts when you hear the president speak like that.
It's never been a one-way street, but there's always been an issue about what we call burden sharing and how much Europe has done versus how much America has done. And President Eisenhower, as a general of the Army, Eisenhower in 1951 became the first NATO commander. And the first letter he wrote back to President Harry Truman was, "The British and the French aren't following through on their commitments." And so it's always been that way. And on the other hand, the fact that President Trump says we'll be there, well, that's a good thing. And so I think despite the sort of tongue lashing that came out, I think you'd find that underneath it, there's an expression of commitment to NATO that's very, very useful. And we have always been there for NATO. And I hope that President Trump meant what he said, that we will always be there for NATO.
Yeah, we've talked about Ukraine a lot over the months and years, General, and there is now reporting that President Zelensky will be in Davos tomorrow to meet with President Trump. That's going to be ahead of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner's meeting that same day with Vladimir Putin. Should we have expectations for progress in these meetings? Is this a war that could end in 2026?
I'd be surprised. Vladimir Putin wants all of Ukraine. He doesn't want an agreement that stops the fighting. He wants to keep the pressure on. You know, thousands of people have left Kyiv because they don't have heat, they don't have electricity, they don't have running water in their apartments, and the mayor has said, please leave, because Vladimir Putin's turning it into a disaster zone. He's not about to stop that. He wants what he wants. Now, what Putin would like to do is place the blame on Zelensky. He'd like to pull Trump in his direction. What President Zelensky wants to do is get more assistance from the United States and use the United States leverage against Putin and have Trump come down. Okay, he's not going to start a war against Russia, but he could do more on sanctions. He could do more on stopping the shadow ghost fleet. He could do more on stopping Russian banking. He could do more on interrupting oil flows. There's a lot that could be done still, and that's what President Zelensky wants. Keep the pressure on Putin. Putin he's not invincible. And if Ukraine's military can make it through this winter with their support, with the support of the people in Ukraine, I think Russia's going to have a very hard time next year, because the rate of innovation in Ukraine's military is actually increasing. So more and more innovation coming in. They're very, very capable military with some outstanding leadership that has emerged also.
Yeah, I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about that because I'd love to hear more of the innovations that you're referring to. But of course, Vladimir Putin was invited by President Trump to take a seat on his board of peace. How do we rationalize these two timelines that we're witnessing? Vladimir Putin bombing residential neighborhoods in Kyiv, yet somehow joining the president's board of peace. What would this board end up doing?
Well, that's always been one of President Trump's strengths, is he's always reaching out there and trying to offer some plums for Putin if he'll cooperate. And so this is another one of these, hey, why don't you come and join the world community instead of fighting? And if Putin says yes, then we've got some more leverage against Putin. So it's not that President Trump is necessarily naive about Vladimir Putin. Now, we don't know where this board of peace is going. Sounds like it's about more than Gaza. But it's also true that if you look at the United Nations, it's been difficult to move things through the United Nations, partly America's fault because there's a lot of those agencies and so forth that we haven't funded, that we've resisted, that we've been angry about for years and years and years in the United Nations. But where's this board of peace going? We don't know yet. But another avenue to put pressure on Lukashenko and Putin, that's not so bad.
Bringing us a dose of optimism this evening, retired four-star Army General Wesley Clark. General, it's good to see you, and thanks for your insights, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, much more ahead, and what we're learning about President Trump's plans to hit the road here, deliver the message on affordability. Weekly travel, they're saying, heading into the midterms. We'll talk to pollster Frank Luntz coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Every time you make it more and more and more affordable for somebody to buy a house cheaply, you're actually hurting the value of those houses. Now, if I want to really crush the housing market, I could do that so fast and people could buy houses, but you would destroy a lot of people that already have houses.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us. The president this morning, Davos, messaging coming as affordability becomes a crisis in the U.S., reaching an inflection point. And as voters look ahead to the midterms this fall, we bring you an important conversation with pollster Frank Luntz, professor at West Point, the founder of FIL. It's great to have you in the studio. I hope your year is starting out well, and welcome back to Bloomberg.
No, it can't be any worse than last year.
Well, that's saying a lot. And depending on who you ask, maybe we're giving it a run for its money here. But I just want to start broadly speaking with what we heard today. What a range of rhetoric that came from Donald Trump in his first day at Davos, following that very long briefing he delivered in the briefing room yesterday. Both were attempting to get to the issue of affordability, but spent the majority of their time on something else.
But that's one of the challenges, is that the public is asking, what do you think? What do you believe? And most importantly, what are you going to do to make my life easier, less expensive, more affordable? And he clearly understands that he's got a problem right now, that the public's looking and they're expecting him to do something about it. The good news for Donald Trump is that the public believes that he can actually make a difference, which they did not believe with Joe Biden last year and the year before. The bad news for him is that they are expecting him to succeed. And inflation and affordability is an issue of perception, not just reality. If you think prices are going up, they are, no matter whether they are or not. And this will certainly have an impact in the fall, which is why they're fighting over every congressional line they possibly can. And what he says in Davos does move markets.
It sure did today. Does this, though, end up being productive for him, time well spent when it comes to that issue of affordability? When Susie Wiles says, we got to get this guy on the road, he's going to be doing apparently a public event every week. Frank, is that what he needs to do?
That's not a big idea, because they've done that in the past. Other presidents have taken to the road. The issue for him is to accept the perception, not declare it as being a hoax, and not yell at people because they don't think he's bringing down prices, is to empathize. And that's not one of the values that he's particularly good at. He's a strong guy. He's a tough guy. He gets in your face and he fights you. But he doesn't engage you. He doesn't relate to you. And that's going to be a challenge for him over the next 9 months.
What do you think of his posture coming off the helicopter this morning, going into this speech, a room full of world leaders, business executives who know the data? They've got terminals. They know the score. They know the inflation rate. They know what GDP was like, and they know what the forecasts are. In many cases, he was using data that was removed from the truth. The room had a bit of a...
I like how you said that.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to be careful here because he knows who was in that room. So who was the actual audience?
But no one actually tries to be careful.
Okay.
Good for you. That people sit in chairs like this and talk to Americans through cameras, and they're stating their point of view rather than trying to get at the truth. We all have our own biases.
Sure.
We all get things wrong from time to time. But the public, particularly the people who watch this network, expect you to look them straight in the eye and deliver the truth. And he should understand that and seek to enhance it rather than simply saying whatever he says for political effect. In the end, you can't tell people that happy days are here again and it's 1932. They just won't believe you. Sure. And he has to get credibility. Susie Wiles is one of the best chiefs of staff in my lifetime because she's telling him you have to be straight.
Does
straight
he
with the
win
American
points
people.
with anyone beyond the base by going to Europe? Is this good domestic politics? Go to Europe and beat them up. He started the speech today by referring to a lot of friends in the room and enemies, by taking it to them. Do people love that?
But that's all he knows how to do.
So it doesn't help him then because he's already associated with that.
But he's looking at it. He won in 2016 and he won in 2024. Both times they told him he couldn't do it. And both times he won. So he's thinking to himself, I've used the strategy before, so why not use it again? And I'd say, because I'm looking at 7% of the electorate, these are people who voted for Donald Trump, not because they wanted Trump, but because they didn't want Kamala Harris. And that 7% is going to determine who controls Congress in 2026. That 7% is not Republican, but they didn't like the Democrats. And those are the people who've moved away from him since the election, which is why his numbers have fallen.
I've got just over a minute. Does Donald Trump have the ability to put himself on the ballot if he stays in front of people with the cadence that the chief of staff would like to see?
Yes, he does, but that is a double-edged sword. In some places, it helps him. He's a turnout magnet. People vote because he's on the ballot.
Right.
But he also turns people off. And in those key swing states, at this moment, he's a neutral. He used to be a positive. He could be a positive at some point in the future. But if he continues on the current track, I think the Republicans will lose control of the House. They'll keep the Senate. In the end, he doesn't empathize. I want him to look straight at the camera and say, I get it, I hear you, and we're going to kick ass the way we've done it before. I hope I can say that language. But he's not doing that. He's kicking the ass of everyone in the room, but he's not fighting for you and me.
Great to see you. Thank you for coming in, as always.
Thank you for having me.
That's Frank Luntz. Of course, there's only one. Professor West Point, founder, FIL. Frank, thank you for the insights. Coming up, the Supreme Court weighing whether or not the president has the authority to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over mortgage fraud allegations. Arguments this morning will discuss the significance of this case. Straight ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. While the president's Davos trip has soaked up the lion's share of the attention, the president's attempt to reshape the Federal Reserve came before the Supreme Court today. This could have been our lead story on any other day, after justices questioned the U.S. Solicitor General over Trump's efforts to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook over unproven allegations of mortgage fraud. The justices expressing some concern over Trump's attempted ousting of Cook, with both Justices Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett openly questioning the president's moves. Joining us now with details here in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, the best Supreme Court reporter in the country. What a day you had. Great to have you back. Why are we so skeptical or so sure that justices are skeptical of this idea?
Well, really because the skepticism came from across the ideological board. Even the conservative justices, and especially actually Brett Kavanaugh, really concerned about what would happen if Donald Trump were able to fire Lisa Cook without even giving her a hearing, without a real clear determination about what for cause means, that key phrase in the statute that says the president can fire Federal Reserve governors for cause. So all indications are that the court is not going to let him fire her, at least immediately.
Okay, and she will stay on the job. For now, this could be months, we understand, before we actually hear a ruling in this case. So she could be at 3 or 4 Fed meetings, presumably in that period of time. Will this come down to defining cause?
It doesn't have
more
to.
Nuanced than
it doesn't. So she has a couple different lines of arguments.
Okay.
One is the process argument, the notion that she didn't even get a chance to defend herself before Trump said she was fired. So the court could just rule narrowly and say, hey, she's entitled to some process. We're not going to allow the firing right now. And that could mean some more lower court back and forth. It could mean eventually it comes back up to the Supreme Court for that bigger question of what is cause.
Interesting. And, of course, in this case could have a great say in what happens to presidential authority over other agencies in this town. But the Fed is a different one. It's a quasi, as we learned from the court back in May.
Yeah, and one interesting thing about this argument was the whole premise of it was the Fed is independent and should stay independent. Now, independence doesn't mean that if somebody has actually done something seriously wrong, they can't be fired. Okay. But the court seemed to think that there ought to be some process. It shouldn't happen so quickly. Even Justice Sam Alito, one of the most conservative justices, said, why are we doing this in such a hurried fashion?
The president has said that he does not plan to fire Jay Powell after flirting with the idea for some time. Does the outcome of this case put a period at the end of that sentence?
It might well, certainly in the atmospherics. Now, one of the issues before the court is because this is actually an emergency application, they don't have to decide the legal issues once and for all. The court can consider what the consequences would be if, say, they let Trump fire Powell. And one of those consequences, according to Lisa Cook and a lot of her allies, is that it would really damage the economy. And if the court talks about that, talks about the notion that firing a governor could damage the economy by undermining its independence, that's got to help Jay Powell as well.
Really interesting. You have an amazing ability to translate this stuff. That's why we need Bloomberg's Greg Stohr. We thank you, Greg, and of course we'll let you know as the case progresses. Officials across the Northeast, if you haven't heard about this, are preparing for a big storm, a winter onslaught, the end of the week, with a major storm expected to spread heavy snow and ice across a 2,000-mile stretch of the country, from the southwest to the east coast. This all starts Friday, causing dangerous travel conditions and ushering in life-threatening cold. During the storm's peak on Sunday, more than half the people living in the contiguous United States are forecast to experience snow, sleet, or freezing rain all at the same time. Joining us now with details, because there could be an economic impact, from our world headquarters in New York, Bloomberg's Lauren Rosenthal. How am I doing here, Lauren? How bad is this going to get?
It's going to be pretty widespread. A lot of people in the U.S. are going to feel it, and it is going to be unusually cold. There are warnings about sub-zero wind chill in, Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, parts of the Austin area. So just really significant, kind of brutal winter cold. In some areas where folks just don't have to put up with this like we do in the Northeast.
Yeah. Texas doesn't have a great track record with this kind of stuff. If we're talking about a massive ice storm, we could also be talking about massive power outages, right? How much is that grid going to be in store for?
Yeah, this is going to be the first big test of the electrical grid in Texas since a big winter storm about 5 years ago. That storm was different in a few ways. For starters, it just went on, for days and days. And this system is going to be, as we talked about, pretty widespread, but it is going to move through rather quickly. So I think the concerns about sort of ongoing high demand as people try to stay warm while they're stuck at home and unable to travel, we're not really seeing those concerns. But at the same time, Texas grid operators have been pretty clear with utilities, have enough fuel on hand for pretty significant heating demand. And we're also talking about a part of the country where folks are really dependent on electricity for home heating. So that also ratchets up the stakes.
Lauren, thank you so much. Stay in touch with us on this. Bloomberg's Lauren Rosenthal counting down to Friday and the arrival of this monster storm. To some quick breaking news now. Bloomberg reporting OpenAI's Sam Altman is in the Mideast, meeting with investors for a $50 billion round, meeting with state-backed funds in Abu Dhabi as it looks at a potential $830 billion valuation. The news coming just hours after another Bloomberg exclusive, Apple revamping Siri as a built-in iPhone Mac chatbot in a bid to fend off OpenAI. And joining us now with their reaction to everything that we've been talking about today, our political panel. Roger Fisk is with us, Democratic strategist, former aide to President Obama, alongside Republican strategist Lanhee Chen, fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Gentlemen, it's great to have you with us. Davos Day, everyone seems to have survived it. Yes, you're not in Davos, which is
clearly
why you're here now. So why don't we get to what we learned today. Lanhee, there have been many taco references since the president put that post on Truth Social. Are we going to get anything we didn't already have in Greenland?
Well, I mean, we'll have to see what the off-ramp looked like, right? The deal that was announced, would it be some combination, for example, of more access to bases? Are there other off-ramps that we don't know about? What are the financial terms of the back-off on tariffs? There's a lot of things we don't know, actually, a lot of things we're yet to find out. But we do seem to be living in a pattern now, right, where the president sort of makes certain claims. He wants certain things to happen. The other side backs down. He claims victory, and we move on with not a lot of policy change.
We've heard about a framework of a plan. We've heard of concepts of a plan. What is the concept of a framework of a plan?
It's very similar to what Lanhee just described. We've said this before. I always try to find at least one point of agreement with the president when I visit, especially here at Bloomberg. And his impulse is normally spot on with a lot of things. But to your point and his point as well, and I've said this before, is also that he thinks the announcement is the policy. And he thinks somehow that there's just some coagulation of the details and things like that that naturally comes together in the days or months after, when we all know that a lot of these things come down to verification, remedy, enforcement, all these kind of things that are going to get worked out on the working group level, which is the level of detail that he really despises because he thinks it's all personality driven. So it's actually going to be months before we actually know what this looks like, if in fact it is even a deal. It wouldn't be the first time that he's gotten out ahead of some of our partners or competitors around the world and announced something that was essentially kind of a notional kind of conversation rather than an actual document that's being worked on.
Interesting. We talked earlier with retired General Wesley Clark, who seemed optimistic that, at least he's talking to leaders. He's even invited Vladimir Putin to the Board of Peace here, and it's the engagement that matters. And the general's been a real critic of the president at some point. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think there is something to be said about, for example, meeting with the Secretary General of NATO and actually having a conversation, as opposed to just sort of saying, look, this is the way it is and it's my way or the highway. I think that the question, though, is at what point do the interlocutors, do the people from the other side, the other leaders decide, this conversation is one that's really not worth having anymore, because there seems to be so much gyration in the policy. There seems to be so much going on. Look, the United States is always going to command the respect, I would hope, of leaders around the world. But I think the big question now becomes, how do leaders react and respond every time now the president going forward makes certain claims?
There were a lot of claims made that had nothing to do with Greenland. Remember, this was supposed to be an affordability speech. Roger, he said inflation has been defeated. He forecast GDP growth, economic growth, to be in the area of 5.5%. By the fourth quarter. He said people are doing very well. They're very happy with me. We've lifted more than 1 million people off of food stamps. Most of the people in that room would have been able to challenge these numbers and even the anecdotal evidence that we see when it comes to consumer sentiment. Will this be the affordability message?
I don't know much, but telling voters that they're wrong is not necessarily proven out to be a winning strategy, or at least even trying to suggest that their perceptions are wrong. And then I think, as we've also seen as recently as earlier today and then yesterday as well, the tip of the iceberg says affordability. And I'm sure when they do their staff meetings and they prep him before he heads out to Detroit or anywhere else or overseas, that it's affordability. And then somehow affordability becomes Ilhan Omar. Somehow affordability becomes, I brought down the price of prescription drugs 1,200%. Which I think if a drug is $100, that means that the pharmaceutical company paid you $1,100 to take the drug.
Yeah.
So those kind of things. So it's to try to get him to kind of stay within those guardrails of what I would imagine Susie Wiles wants, back to Frank Luntz's comments, is the challenge, because left to his own devices, obviously he's just going to be a subject of kind of shiny object syndrome.
I talked earlier, following the president's speech, about the economic claims, specifically with Lael Brainerd, former Fed vice chair, of course, chaired the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden White House. Here's what she said.
I think the polling, similar to the consumer sentiment data, suggests that actually there has been a precipitous decline in sentiment about the economy. And what we've seen in some recent elections is that a lot of Americans want the president to deliver on his promise to bring down prices on day one. Instead, prices have gone up a lot, and people are very concerned about affordability.
So this sounds a lot like the Biden years when it comes to telling people how they feel, trying to message around high prices, inflation, affordability, whatever you want to call it. Frank Luntz said something interesting here, though, that while they're both dealing with the same issues, Trump has something in common with Biden. More people are confident that President Trump has the ability to fix it. So how does he seize on that opportunity?
Well, this was core to his victory in 2024, the perception that he was better equipped to handle the economy. And I think he retains some of that halo, notwithstanding what the consumer sentiment data say now. I think the reality is that there's two things. First of all, the president is going to have to continue to message aggressively on this, precisely because there are a lot of other things he likes to talk about, and it's never really a focused message. But this is one where I think he does need to focus. And then the other issue is, for Republicans, it's always been a little unclear to me how much of an impact there is in terms of what Republicans get, what they benefit from, versus what Trump benefits from. In other words, a lot of Republicans have tried to run the Trump playbook and haven't been successful.
Well,
And so the issue really comes down to how much of this is going to inure to the benefit of House and Senate Republicans running for re-election. That remains to be seen. But the president needs to be the messenger. He needs to be the lead messenger on these affordability issues.
The president's going to be meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow in Davos. He's making the trip to Davos to sit down with the president. Wesley Clark was not hopeful when we spoke with him about this. Do you expect any breakthrough in 2026 when it comes to the war in Ukraine? This is the president who is vying for a Nobel Peace Prize.
One would hope. I like to think I'm an optimist, and there's been flickers of some kind of affinity between them, but we don't have to think back all that far to kind of that bum rush in the Oval Office with the vice president, which was a global embarrassment in my mind to treat someone in the way that they did there. The president, open societies are difficult. You don't get everything that you want. And there's a big part of the president, and this is why I think that he's also gravitated much more to the world scene as the domestic situation has become more complex and challenging for him, that because the executive powers allow him to flex more muscle independently, that he likes the idea of a much more ordered society, and he clearly has an affinity for the leaders of some of the more closed societies around the world, because open societies are frustrating, and I get that. But so what I don't think is necessarily established is that guiding fledgling democracies or countries under attack towards the North Star of the Western democratic experiment. I don't think that that's necessarily the president's emotional North Star, because he actually gravitates more towards societies and governing structures where the president can mandate people's behavior and things like that.
Interesting. What a great conversation with Roger Fisk and Lonnie Chen. Our panel is going to stay with us with much more ahead here. Coming up, more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Shortly after the president took the stage at Davos, down the National Economic Council director and Federal Reserve Chair candidate Kevin Hassett swung by the Bloomberg set and spoke with our Anne-Marie Hordern, where he spoke about everything from AI and tariffs to the president. Let's listen.
President Trump is disrupting an order that needs to be disrupted, and I think that markets are celebrating because of that.
Do you think that tariff uncertainty, though, we got a whiff of Liberation Day this week because of what was going on with Greenland, do you think we are past the most peak moment of tariff uncertainty for financial markets, for consumers, and for other countries?
Well, I think the tariffs have surprised a lot of mainstream economists. I used to be one of those guys, at least on the tariff front, where I've been surprised, especially.
Now you're a true believer.
It's just astonishing that everything that's in the models that we were taught when I was in grad school just turned out not to be true. And we have, I think, a strong understanding economically of why that is. It's basically that if we have a trade deficit with China forever and ever, then by definition, they're basically dumping into the U.S. with inelastic supply. And so if we put a tariff on them, then they bear the tariff. And the same thing is true for Europe. If we have a big trade deficit with them for a long time, then they basically cut their prices in order to maintain market share in the U.S. And I think the question is, the interesting question that I've been puzzling over and talking to some of my mainstream economist friends is, why is this so positively disruptive? Has President Trump's agenda been so positively disruptive for Europe? And I think that one of the things is that he's made them lift their game in terms of restoring the global order by increasing defense spending. But also, remember, it used to be that we were always talking about zombie companies in Europe. We've kind of stopped doing that, haven't we? And I kind of wonder if the competition that's created by the tariff and the tariff uncertainty hasn't been a real shot in the arm for the European economy.
We've heard a lot of people on Bloomberg talk about that. Actually, what Trump is pushing Europe to do is to do what's good for them.
Right.
But are you concerned about any of these unintended consequences? We saw Spain go over and have a very cozy relationship with China last year. Prime Minister Mark Carney just went over to China. Then he came here to Davos and talked about how the world order that we know is dead. And if you are a middle country and you're at the table, you're going to get eaten. Is there potentially this consequence where we push our allies closer to China, which is the U.S.'s biggest adversary?
No, I don't think that's happening at all. And I think that what is happening is that people are learning, indeed the people here at Davos, that's one reason why we're here to spread the news, is that we've got all this analysis that says that Trump's plan is working. It's working both for the U.S. economy and for the global economy. And I think that people in the end, they look at their wallets, they see how it's going. And in the United States, they're going to see a couple quarters of 5% growth and booming markets, booming wages. And if they see that everywhere else, then I think that it'll have a big political effect. I think the people who make the most noise attacking President Trump aren't necessarily speaking for their countries. They're speaking for their very, very liberal policies. You've seen President Trump call some of them out in the last few days.
You can find our full conversation with Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, his sit-down with Anne-Marie at Davos online or on the terminal. Back with us this evening's political panel, Democratic strategist Roger Fisk, Republican strategist Lonnie Chen. Gentlemen, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on this conversation, because the administration is promising big stuff. Not only the golden age, but 5.5% growth. Your wages are going up, Roger, a chicken in every pot. This is a good way to expose yourself in a midterm cycle.
5% sounds very optimistic to me. I mean, when the American auto industry's sales to Canada are down 38%. You have some iconic whiskey brands in Kentucky that are shutting down production for 2026, which hits you and me, Joe, right where we live.
I thought we did our work.
But when you start to have iconic American brands that are on the ropes.
Yes.
The other thing that concerns me about this is, say even everything that these guys talk about works, what's missing from all of this conversation is a robust plan to train the next generation of the American worker. There's no conversation around working with trade schools and community colleges around robotics and AI and automation and all these other things. So ostensibly, these CEOs around the world are going to fold up their tents and come to the United States. And if they're bringing in like high-tech jobs from Germany, for example, we need to be ready to meet that on the skill level, and that's just not happening. There's no preparation of the next generation of American worker, and that to me makes me convinced that this is a lot more air than it is real traction and real activity in any policy context.
Yes, what do you think, Lonnie?
Well, look, I think the administration, midterms are always a referendum.
What happens when you put out a forecast like that and you don't make it?
I don't know that it matters much anymore.
Why break into jail, I guess, is my question.
But I guess my point is, in our politics today, there's a lot of promises thrown around. There's a lot of things people say, And it's not clear to me that there's a price to be paid for saying whatever you think you want to say in this regard. So, well, I'm not saying it's a good answer. It's just, I think, the reality of where we are. Look, 5% is incredibly ambitious. We've always talked about the 5% growth as the North Star, right? The sort of golden goblet that we all aim for.
Sure.
But the reality is that in this economy, with productivity where it is, and with some of the challenges that are systemic to this transition that we're going through now as we move toward the increased adoption of machine learning and AI, it's very hard to hit 5%. And so, you know, whether the administration hits it or not, I hope they do. Yeah. I hope we all do. But the reality is, politically, I'm not sure it matters very much anymore.
I think it's pretty interesting the way Kevin Hassett has fallen off the top of the short list to become the new Fed chair. What do you make of this evolution? A lot of this has to do with the criminal investigation into Jay Powell. We're told that we could get an announcement as soon as next week. Are we going to hear a name potentially that we haven't heard yet? Or do we know who the next Fed chair is? Is his name Kevin?
And odds seem good that it's one Kevin or another.
That's what we thought.
One thing we know about the president, and this is neither good nor bad, but he bases a lot of these decisions just on personal chemistry, and he'll call people and text them after seeing them on TV and things like that.
Loyalty.
And Kevin Hassett, I think, has always been a very effective, upbeat cheerleader. I don't know much about the personal dynamics of it.
Sure.
But it will be, and then as the president says, we'll see. So there's always the capacity for a surprise.
He keeps things pretty open. Do you expect an announcement next week, and will it be a name that we've heard?
I don't know on the timing. I think the president likes to keep us all guessing in that regard. Because remember, at one point he said he had made a decision, and then today he said that apparently a decision hasn't been made. So look, I do think that, as we were discussing earlier, that there's something, the most important trait the president is looking for here is some element of malleability and loyalty. And I think, some would be alarmed by that, but that is the reality of what the president's looking for. So does he feel he has that in one of the existing candidates? If he doesn't feel he has that, he's going to go shopping elsewhere.
Wow.
And guess what? There are plenty of people who'd love to be Fed chairman. So I don't think there's any shortage of candidates.
Wow. Well, we're going to find out. We'll call both of you guys when we do. Roger Fisk and Lonnie Chen helping us distill another wild day in international politics. Thank you both for a great conversation and a great panel. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. The president's still in Davos. You can find it on the terminal and online. And there's going to be a lot more news where this came from tomorrow. So be sure to join us back here on Bloomberg. Thank you for being with us today on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.